Hello everyone. Today I'm going to be presenting another Franck violin sonata, which I'm currently learning, and will be playing for my final recital. And I'm going to be giving you a more or less comprehensive guide to the sonata's additions and who influenced those additions. So my goal with this presentation and eventually with my research paper is to provide specifically performers with an understanding not only of the score itself and what edition to go to, but more specifically with an understanding of who the people were who were involved with the actual creation of this music, and that it's not so cut and dry to say that it's Franck's composition and he did it and everything that's in there is his intentions, because I don't think that provides I think that's too black and white, and I don't think that provides an accurate or interesting analysis of the work. Above all, I want listeners and performers to understand that composers aren't gods. They're people, or they were people, in Franck's case, and that performers are adding to a tradition of music making and of composition in their own right when they take up, the Mendelssohn Concerto for the 17th millionth time it's ever been played. That they're adding to a tradition, and that's important. That they're not just regurgitators. When you understand the different transformations that a piece has gone through in its past, and how we do that in the classical tradition is through scoring, then you understand what is within the realm of possibility in your own presentation of that work, so that you're not just obeying the letter of your teachers or your Schirmer's edition's law. Also, before I get further into it, I just want to acknowledge that I rely fairly considerably on the Peter Joss article. Editions also have their histories, the revisions of César Franck's violin sonata. It's a great article. Peter Joss is the current editor of the editor of the most recent Franck edition for Henley, and he writes about how Henley has gotten to the place they've gotten to with this piece. So it's been a great jumping off point. So I just want to acknowledge that up front. I guess before I actually get into it, I'm just going to give a little bit of background on Franck. So he was born in Liège in 1822 to a Liègian father and a German mother. Liège at the time was actually under Dutch rule, and then Belgian while he was still living there, and then he ended up moving to France later on, but I'll get to that. So he was a romantic composer and an organist and a pianist. He was touted by his father as a child prodigy, mixed financial success with that. So he ended up putting him back into the conservatory in Paris, the Paris Conservatoire, to study and compose as well as to perform. And in that time, he managed to gain a name for himself as a fantastic pianist, organist, and improviser, but not yet as a composer. And that really didn't happen until much later in his life. It was really with the success of his piano quintet in F minor in 1879 that he was seen as a legitimate compositional force, and this was further concreted, as you might expect, by the violin sonata that he wrote in 1886 as a wedding gift to Isai. Interestingly, Isai performed that piece the same day that he received the music for it on the day of his wedding. So, busy guy, but I'll get to that story later. So before we get into the sonata proper, I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the terms I'm going to be using. So I think for the most part, all these are pretty obvious and used fairly frequently by all of us, so no worries there. The one I'm going to be using quite a bit, just maybe a little bit more obscure, is autograph or autograph manuscript, and that's just basically a manuscript that's specifically written by the composer themselves. So now onto the sonata. The Franck sonata spans 4 movements. It's written in cyclic form, meaning that thematic material returns throughout different movements and isn't just encapsulated to the movement that it's first produced in. And it's also a very nice piece to listen to. I highly recommend it. One interesting thing to note is that the sonata's various early editions are all quite different from one another, which, especially if you're a Urtext publisher, begs the question: how do you write an Urtext edition to a piece when the composer's own stance on the piece's true form changes? To begin to tackle this, and in so doing, to begin to understand the starting off point that Franck gave performers with this work, we're going to look at the primary sources of this work. So the first is the autograph, and that's the original version. It has the original version that he wrote out himself. So this has much less detailed dynamics, tons of written errors, and particularly a lot of discrepancy between the top line violin in the piano score and the violin part itself, which we'll get to later. The second primary source that we're going to look at is the first edition. So the first edition is the first printed edition of the sonata. It's corrected a bunch of those errors as more detailed dynamics, and there's quite a number of stylistic differences, especially in tempo changes. So the last primary source that we're going to be looking at is the cello sonata, and so that's an arrangement by Jules Assart for cello and piano of the original work, and it was actually the last edition of the work supervised by Franck. So he actually gave his stamp of approval. We have correspondences that show that. They also worked at the conservatory together. So the difference with this one, there's multiple editorializations to fit the cello's range and strengths. Then there's further corrections from the autograph, and then a bunch of other minor changes. But there's also some areas where there are actual note changes that aren't just to fit the cello's range, that are to elicit a different character in the piece itself, which I think is the more interesting area to focus on, which we will. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, in the autograph copy, there were a ton of discrepancies between the violin part itself and the violin line in the piano score. And this is all due to Armand Perron, who was asked by the same to revise the violin part of the autograph. He made a bunch of edits to the part and had a big influence on articulation and phrasing. But the discrepancy comes from the fact that Franck just was too lazy and didn't bother to transfer it to the score. So the autograph violin part and the autograph piano score top line violin, they have a whole bunch of discrepancies in them. And one of those discrepancies I've put up here. You have a huge change. It's only 2 slurs, but as a musician, that presents an entirely different view of how those final bars to one of those 4 movements, how they should sound and how they should be played, and that has a big impact on the piece as a whole. So another important performer who was influential on this piece was Eugenie Zay, who the piece was written for. Many of the differences between the autograph and the first edition print are a result of Zay. In being the first violinist to rigorously playtest literally this piece, Zay offered valuable input to Franck on various different aspects about how he thinks the piece could be developed and changed. Now, there's an infamous story about how one of these changes came about. So, on the first ever performance of this work, it was scheduled at the very end of a long program that started at 3 p.m. In mid-December. So, you can imagine it starts getting dark out fast. So, Zay's performing this in a art gallery, and as it gets later and later and later and he gets further into the end of the program, in this art gallery in the 1800s, there are no artificial lights and candles are not allowed in there because otherwise you can burn down the entire place. So Zay and his brother Theo, who's on the piano part, are left with less and less light to read the music with. So when they get to the start of the first movement, they take it up a notch to try to get as much of it done as they can before darkness sets in. Now, this doesn't actually end up helping because they end up having to play the last 3 movements entirely by memory in pitch black. But when the next day, one of Franck's pupils calls out this egregious affront to the music, Franck himself exclaims, "Oh no, Izai played it right. Actually, I'm going to put it into the music the way he played it. I just didn't know that that was the correct way to play it yet." And so for the first edition, he changed it from the opening speed in the first movement to be allegro ben moderato rather than just allegro moderato. So the next important performer, or in this case transcriber, that we're going to be talking about is Jules Dessart. Now he was playing in that same concert, that same premiere of the Franck Sonata in a quartet with Izai, and he heard the Franck Sonata for the first time and fell in love with it and begged Franck to let him write a cello sonata version of it. Now, many of the discrepancies between the violin first edition and the cello first edition are minor discrepancies, corrections, and transcription necessities to allow the piece to be playable for the cello. But some of them are stylistic and even notational differences, which were all given the stamp of approval by Franck, which is very interesting. At the end of the second movement, for instance, I have up on the board here, you actually can see that the tonic of D is given to the closing chord of that movement, which gives a completely different feeling and air to that chord versus the violin original part. So now, venturing past Franck's death in the late 1800s and into the 20th century, this piece was full-heartedly adapted into the style of the 20th century greats. So you get the holy trinity of even wider vibrato, lyricism above all else, and no concern for era. Although with this style of piece, that ended up actually working out perfectly fine. But, they were doing the same with Bach, and that wasn't so great. So going later into the century, Menuhin himself, a man who championed the piece, ended up writing fingerings and bowings for Henley into the edited violin part accompanying their text. So he bridged many of the final gaps between what was intuitive to the performer and what was written, such as assimilating bowings in parallel passages. You have two passages that are the exact same with the same dynamics, but their bowings are different. Why? Menuhin fixed this. This edition, along with the accompanying text of the Franck Sonata, is used to this day more than any other. And I think that in and of itself shows the influence of performers like Menuhin on this work. Into the current day, both Henley and Bärenreiter, the leading producers of text, now refer to the first edition rather than the autograph for authoritative text. They also refer to the cello edition quite often. This means that Perrin and Dessart and Izai, all, as well as Menuhin and any other performer who's had any influence that I haven't mentioned yet myself, all of their compositional and musical intuition is ingrained in the work that people read the world over. This isn't a work written solely by Franck anymore. It's something that's been passed down through generations by great composers and performers to other great performers, and it's something that the world shares compositionally. Now, that might seem a little bit hokey, but so is the idea of a composer as a god, and I think that the importance of all this is to try to find a medium between seeing the composers as the gods and the performers as the gods. You want to find something where both are seen as human and you get to interact over time, as is the beauty of music, with those performers and those composers. Over the course of this presentation, I'm hoping that I'll have been able to demonstrate there's something really special in understanding the relationship that Franck, the sonata, and the musicians have all had with each other, as well as you as a musician, that there's something special that you can be a part of, and that you're not just here to regurgitate. In conclusion, I conclude that it's not just important but correct to develop an understanding of those who influence important works, both as an individual performer and in this field of research as a whole. This humanizes the composer and gives credit where credit is due to performers who had major influences on the works that we now call Tchaikovsky violin concerto, or Mendelssohn, or in this case, Franck. It also presents a much more accessible narrative of the past and a more creative mentality for the future, where performers participate in the ever-continuing composition of the works rather than just spitting it out for an audience of grandparents as the 10,000th in a row to do so. The language that we use to separate the performer from the composer paints this picture of these two crafts that don't intermingle and don't have an effect on one another. And that's just not the state of art. That's not the state of music. And I hope that I've convinced you of that fact. Thank you very much.